So joining us is Elise James-Decruz, who is the award-winning learning and development professional and diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner with over 20 years of global experience in the marketing strategy, design, and delivery of programs and experiences for clients, partners, and industry professionals within the workplace, workforce, and marketplace and community. So very excited. Elise is also in a new role as the Chief Equity Officer at the Ad Council. Elise will oversee the organization's ongoing commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, ultimately informing every aspect of the Ad Council's mission, workplace culture, and public-facing communication. So welcome, Elise. And also with us today is Ronda Carnegie. Ronda is a big thinker, builder, and connector who is currently Chief Innovation Officer of the Female Quotient, leading the business of equality practice. Known for her role as part of the leadership team building the TED brand, she founded the TED Institute, an internal consultancy to identify internal ideators, inventors, connectors, and creators. Intensive one-on-one talk development for every event that was produced, filmed, and hosted by TED. And I know that's a lot of events. So joining these two wonderful women leaders will be Power to Fly's own Hunter Canning, who in addition to being a wonderful moderator, is a New York-based actor, puppeteer, producer, and photographer. So with that, I welcome everyone to turn your cameras on and kick off this conversation. So thank you for being here and have a great talk.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. And thank you, Rhonda and Elise, for being here today. I'm really excited to jump in with you guys. Can you talk about, perhaps, Rhonda, before we jump into the topic at hand, can you tell me a little bit about part of your career trajectory and what motivated you to want to make a change in media representation for women and girls?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, so good to be here. I loved just hearing about what was going on with the t-shirts and all the ways that you can participate and support this community. So thank you for that. You know, when my background is in publishing, I worked at Condé Nast for over 20 years working on different media entities. Probably my longest assignment there was the New Yorker, and seeing how always working with marketers on how they were portraying their messaging. I went from there, as was said, to TED, and always just, again, really very interested in the role of women and how they were expressing and portraying their ideas and the power of that to change the world in a very powerful way, and created the TED Institute and then TED Women. And then I ended up working in a communications agency. I really wanted to get at just the content piece of it, the storytelling piece of it, building that on top of the work I was doing at TED. And then had an opportunity to come to the Female Quotient, really called to duty to be able to work with organizations on really seeing what we can do to change this equation. What does that look like? And how can we all be conscious leaders? And that body of work is where I am now. And so excited to see the momentum that's going on in the industry. So Hunter, thanks so much for having me on this discussion and conversation.
Oh, thank you for being here. It's truly a pleasure. And Elise, can you tell me a bit about your trajectory and also what motivated you to make these changes?
Absolutely. My background started in education, really trying to understand how curriculum can meet the learners where they are along the journey, and really being thoughtful and intentional about not only the environment and the learner-centered culture that you want to create within that environment, but also the types of experiential learning that can take place to get people connected to the topic or the subject. Fast forward after my graduate studies and corporate training, I fell into the ad tech space and working for many startups in the space, both early and late stage, having spent a significant amount of time at an ad tech company called Media Math. And that's where I really started to realize the lack of representation for Black and Brown people within the space, and also for women. And through my lived experience heading up corporate education, certification, and training programs, I started to think about ways that I can make an impact and create space for learning, create space for conversations that are safe, not knowing every single acronym in the playbook, if you will, and creating those spaces to really unpack some of the nuances and complexities within the ad tech market. And I didn't have a head of diversity, equity and inclusion role or head of multicultural marketing role to realize that I could have an impact. So pretty early on in my career, I started to create those spaces and create opportunities for myself to connect with people who wanted a similar space within one of the fastest growing industries on the planet at the time, and probably still is, ad tech and martech. And I'm really excited to be here today. To kind of share my journey and perspective, and also learn from Rhonda and contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that, Elise. So Rhonda, let's jump right in. So why is an accurate portrayal of women and girls in the media important?
Well, first of all, I just have to say it's so great to be with Elise on this call, and you, Hunter, because Elise and I are working on so many things, and one of them is unconscious bias in ad tech. And so I know we'll come back around with it, but it is really something that Lisa and I both think very deeply around. And so the why is in this notion of unconscious bias, which is where this work is revealed. And the source, She Knows Media, says that more than 70% of women think brands should be responsible for using advertising accurately to message to women and girls. And yet gender bias in media and advertising still often persists. And there was an author by the name of Julia T. Wood, who's really a leader in gender communication. And I was reading an article that she wrote that was published by NYU called The Influence of Media on the Views of Gender. And she really talked about, and this is really important, about how women who are underrepresented falsely implies that men are cultural standard and that women are unimportant and invisible. And we see this not only in women, but just in all areas of identity. And so we know that it's absolutely critical that we break stereotypical ways in which we are reflected and we sustain socially endorsed views on gender. And then lastly, I'll just say there is absolutely a financial incentive for brands to get this right and to support equality in their marketing messages.
Mm-hmm. Elise, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you, Rhonda. And the earlier that we can start the conversation, the better, right? With our girls, creating space for them to speak up. Starting to have those conversations as early as possible around career paths, right? Ensuring that they, even if they don't see themselves, that they have enough confidence to be able to push forward. A lot of times you might, as a Black girl, I didn't see a lot of professionals and leaders who look like me, and being able to, stay the course. And stay curious around some of the career paths that you can go into, I think is really important, and will inevitably support seeing the images, in the media. And I would also just add, it's equally as important to have the conversations with boys as well. I'm fortunate enough to have a boy, 16-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl, and creating the space to have those conversations with him as well. right? To be able to shape the narrative and have him think about the role that girls and women play is equally as important.
Thank you both for that. And just a reminder to the audience, if anyone wants to ask any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We have these two amazing women here that are here to answer questions for you. Please use them as resources. So just to play devil's advocate for a minute, some people might say that like an accurate portrayal of, women and girls, or really anyone, you could broaden it up, but we're specifically talking about this, isn't important because, we know it's fake, it's fictional, it's not real. So, it's all fantasy. So we won't be like ingesting that. What would be your response to that, Rhonda?
Well, so it's so interesting. And everyone who's watching this will totally connect with this. But when you see a baby, when there's a baby, and we know that children from the beginning are not biased in any way. They don't have the vocabulary for it. But have you ever been in a market and you hear some young kid blurt out something that they heard on television or what their parents said? I think someone sent me a video of their daughter who was, using the F word, and she kept using it over and over and over again. The point being that you're absolutely right, and it doesn't start in the beginning. But if you look at the numbers of how many hours that people are watching television, I think, it's even more than 9 hours a day that the numbers are in terms of media. If you remove the amount of time that people are asleep or in the bathroom, media occupies more than half of, let's say, a teen's day. And then you add to that advertising, which has become so much a part of our culture. And there's no surprise to me, that, just in playing devil's advocate, that media such as advertising, television, and movies substantially affects this conversation, your health and your well-being. And I know, Elise, you can really connect to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of TikToking going on at the Decruz household and media consumption. And with that, it also provides an opportunity to have conversations about topics that I might not have otherwise been exposed to. So I think it's not always negative. I think there is an opportunity to connect with one another, whether it's your children or your significant other or family members or colleagues. But it does provide an opportunity to have the conversations within the media.
Yeah. Now, do you think there are? I love the example that you had, Rhonda, of the little kid in the store, because I have a little niece, and I've witnessed they're sponges. They just soak that right up, and you're like, oh wow, I didn't realize we said that around her, but she got it. So I identify with that as well. And so if it's seeping in at this early age, and then you spoke about these unconscious biases that we're carrying into our lives, and then there must be ramifications that are in the workplace then for these inaccurate portrayals of women. We talk about the bro culture and all of that stuff. Can you speak to like what these ramifications, how they show up in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing it with moms. Look at moms in the workplace right now and the portrayal of moms, this idea that moms can do it all, in terms, and I think and by the way, brands are getting better at, changing these messages, but you think about how quickly you have to react, but you have moms who are burned out. A lot of people are really burned out from the pandemic, and increasingly more so than men. And so despite this, it's so important that women leaders have really an accurate portrayal, meaning that all women and just people can support employees' well-being and diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, so that we are actually really seeing a diverse workplace in a way that we haven't seen before. I think also part of that is, again, the stereotypical sense of what you think you perceive women are like, who are living their work life and their home life. And I know Elise as a mom, did definitely connect with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, Rhonda. I think the impact that it has on the workplace can show up in different ways. It's very nuanced and can be complex, but it can show up in policies, right? It could show up in organizational structure, right? Not thinking a female leader is equipped to lead an organization through good times and in bad times. It can show up in best practices within the workplace, hiring, firing, pay. Right. So, I think that there's there are a lot more conversations to be had, but creating a culture of inclusion, as Rhonda shared, is so important to ensure that women and underrepresented, groups feel as though their voice matters. Right. And once you feel like your voice matters, then you can go to the next step to ensure that your voice can be heard, right? So I just think that there's a big opportunity to shift the narrative around the role that women leaders can play within an organization to transform it, in a really thoughtful and intentional way.
Mm. And on that note, we had an audience question from Stephanie, how can we change things? And so Stephanie asked, how could marketing leaders drive change in content when producing their own content or choosing mediums to advertise?
Yeah, well, I think that promising. I think this is really promising. If you talk to market leaders, there's so many aspects to this conversation. And, there is what does the creative look like? Like, that's just one part of it. But then there's also who's behind the camera, who are the people who are shooting the messaging. And so where are we thinking about that from that point of view? And then all the way through to where are you placing the media? And Ad Council with IBM have done some really interesting work recently around taking a look at campaigns and just looking at how ad tech is optimizing. I know this is like a little nerdy, but how ad tech is optimizing right now. And so messages aren't actually reaching, wide audiences because of the technology that's built in. And so all I want to say is that this is a big ecosystem. And so market leaders play such a role and responsibility, not only in the creative messaging, but in the production and in the ad tech that goes with it. And it's really a much bigger kind of conversation here. And so we absolutely need market leaders at the table and CEOs at the table. We need people at the top of the organization who are acknowledging that equity and equality and diversity is really good for business.
Agreed. Yeah, the only thing I would add is also making sure that you have the people in the room that the creative is representing, right? Holding space for them as well, to provide insight into the narrative and the imagery to ensure that it is inclusive. And I would just add one more piece around the role that storytelling plays, right? We have a lot of forward progress as it relates to the data, right? And the role that plays as part of a marketing journey, but also making sure that we have leaders in the room to be able to tell that story in a really engaging and an authentic way that truly meets the consumer where they are and they feel included.
And what would you say is the real and potential economic benefits you mentioned earlier, Rhonda, we would touch on, what are the economic benefits of an accurate portrayal of women and girls in the media?
Yeah, well, I think it's really about labor participation, like just getting more people into the workplace. And we've heard words this last year, the great resignation, the great retention. This is really about people and the idea of an inclusive environment. These are all ideas where we're grappling with the economic impact of women and others pulling out of the workforce and the cost that has to the industry. And so how can we get people back into the workforce again? And it is in the portrayal. I was just part of International Women's Day. I'm working with Vodafone, and they have an alliance called Change the Face of the Technology Industry. And they had done a research, and they asked the industry, based on the advertising, if you were to describe the industry, how would you describe it? And they said white and male. And so that just goes to show you, and this is like people who are thinking about getting into tech. And so just think about in an industry like tech where you see that. So if we can get more people to see themselves in the workplace, in workplace patterns, and also just in the workplace in general, then we'll see, the pie will get bigger. Economic opportunities will allow more people to participate.
Elise, would you like to add on to that?
The only thing I would add is, thinking about ways that we can prepare the next generation of marketing professionals to run this. Right. It's never too early to have the conversation around the lack of representation within the field. Right. We can see it. We don't need to hide behind it. We can be, as transparent as we need to be and, crystallize it so that we can provide access to experiences, access to conversations and people that might, change the trajectory of a, future female leader, right, who's currently exploring this industry. So I think the more transparent and honest and vulnerable that we can be as an industry about where we fall short, the better. I just think it's really important to ensure that we're preparing the next generation in a way that moves us closer to where we want to be.
You know what, Elise, I was going to say, the other thing that sparks with me on that is the whole idea of women of color and their advancement within the workplace and how, and this is about internal comms too, but how they see themselves, how they see executives moving up in organizations and just really being able to understand who can mentor me and what does that look like. And I know that that's something that you think about. That I'm just sparked continuing by what I'm reading about, what we're learning in that area.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, the role that mentorship plays is so important in the advancement for women of color, as well as sponsorship. Right, given the numbers that we've seen in terms of the percentages and lack of representation. Acknowledging that, women of color might not be in the room where the decisions are being made. So, how can we create those partnerships and relationships with allies and non-women of color to speak on our behalf as they're in the room and to see the benefit of that across the organization. So I couldn't agree with you more. And thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. Cindy asks, how do we get leaders to participate in DEI and not just send their workforce to a workshop and check that box for the year? So instead of just not doing lip service, but how do we get them to actually get into action and make change?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think Elise in terms of her learning, but, I do think that oftentimes people within companies walk around with a hammer and they're looking to find a nail that they can, it's like, let me check that off. Like, okay, it's solved. And I also find within companies that many times there are individuals who are good at rendering advice, but not necessarily the doers. And so we need to get more people within an organization to be a doer. And the way that we're going to get them to be a doer is to find a way to personally connect them to something. So it's not just getting to do the workshop, but can you take this on specifically, or really just trying to figure out too, like, how do we give and receive feedback, which is a big part of this work that is so important. So this is something that, at the Female Quotient, we're thinking about all the time, and trying to move cultures from what we call from nice to real to brave enough to change that cultural transformation.
Yeah, I love what you said, Rhonda, around creating space for leaders to emotionally connect with the work. And I think that's really where it starts, right? I mean, understanding that diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging is a journey, right? And everyone's on a different spectrum of their DEI journey, both personally and professionally. And extending as much grace as possible to leaders to reflect on their why is also an important part of the process too. Because people can see through leaders who are not authentic or genuine in their commitment to advancing DEI. And then, lastly, one of the things that I try to do in cascading the DEI work is to ensure that I'm meeting each leader where they are along their journey, right? And really creating that shared language. When we're talking about DEI, we're talking about internal and external. So if you have a leader who's primarily focused on the external work in their day-to-day, then meet them where they are. Let's talk about the role that supplier diversity plays, right? and getting proper representation with vendors and partners. If you're talking with a leader who's focused on, internal work, let's talk about how we can create micro and macro experiences within the organization to foster inclusion and belonging. So it's really, a matter of extending grace, partnering with leaders to create the space for themselves to unpack their why, and partner with them along their journey. And it doesn't mean that they're going to transform overnight, but understanding that it's going to take a lot of work, like self-work, to get to that place, right? If we constantly talk about it within our echo chamber, you referenced that earlier, Rhonda, not specific to DEI, but if you're constantly doing the work in that bubble, if you will, and then you're afraid to engage with individuals that don't look like you, or might not have gone to the same school as you, or might not have lived in the same town as you, then you're defeating the purpose, right? It's really about stretching yourself to connect with people and experiences, and to listen, at the end of the day, so people can share their truth, right? And you can connect with it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you're looking for a title of your next book, Extending Grace and Unpacking the Why sounds like a really good one to me.
I love that. Great idea,
please.
sir. Yes. I love that. Let's do that.
Love it.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. I feel like I could talk to you all day. Thank you for taking the time out of to celebrate National Women's Day with us today. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, Rhonda. I really appreciate this conversation.